Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Dr. Adrienne Torres again. I'm here with Truth in My Days director John Torres for a discussion about another important topic. John, you did a series on who wrote the gospel books. You said that liberal scholars and skeptics insist that the books are anonymous. No one knows who wrote them. But it was not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As you explained, this was not based on evidence, but was simply bias.
Yes. As I pointed out, during the era of the Enlightenment back in starting in the 16th century, really taking off in the 17th and then the 18th century in particular, an ethos developed among the intellectual leaders of society, the philosophers, the professors, to make man the measure of all things, to enthrone man and to drive out God. And that required undermining Christianity. And the best way to do that was to discredit the Bible, in particular the New Testament, and especially the gospel books. Because if you can get rid of that, you can undercut the case for Jesus and thereby, of course, destroy Christianity. Now, the problem for them is that as we understood it, the gospel books were written by eyewitnesses, which meant that they were trustworthy as historical documents. And so they had to deny that they were written by eyewitnesses. They had to claim that the books were not really written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But as I showed in those earlier programs, the evidence completely demolishes these claims.
You mentioned that the dates of publication of the gospel books is fundamentally linked to their authorship.
Yes. And again, as I mentioned before, when we talk about publication in the ancient world, we mean the time at which the book is released for public use. Now, since the goal was to discredit the gospel books, the goal of these opinion makers, and since eyewitness testimony was the gold standard, it was not enough simply to claim that the books were anonymous. It was necessary to convince people that they were not eyewitness testimony. And that requires two elements. You see, because even if the books were anonymous, if Matthew, Mark, and John were not the authors, still, if they're written in eyewitness times, they have credibility because the writers could still have been eyewitnesses, and there were living eyewitnesses at the time who could have debunked anything they said that was wrong. So it was not enough for them to say that the books were anonymous. They also had to late date them. They had to claim that the books were published long after the time of Jesus.
So what was the claim they settled on?
They settled on the bald assertions of one scholar, a certain Ferdinand Christian Bauer, F.C. Bauer, who lived from 1792 to 1860. He was a highly respected scholar, teacher at the Tübingen School in what is now Germany. And the Tübingen School was the most respected theological school among liberal scholars. And Bauer dated Matthew, the first gospel book, he dated it to the year AD 130. Why do you think he picked that date?
Could it be 100, so many years later, maybe more than 100 years later than the events? That would mean that they're not accurate and they're not from eyewitnesses?
Exactly. He had no evidential basis, no reason for picking 130. But if Jesus died in the year AD 30, as he thought, it was actually 33. But if he died in AD 30, hey, let's just add 100 years to that. Bingo, Gospel of Matthew is out of eyewitness times. And so magically, Matthew was written in AD 130. That's where the date came from.
I mean, was the number picked out of a hat, or did he have actually some evidence or something he based his guess on?
No, the number was essentially picked out of a hat, but even more was deliberately picked to put the book out of eyewitness times. There was no actual evidence, and that's actually standard practice for liberal biblical scholarship. And do note, by liberal, we mean scholars who deny the supernatural. Liberal biblical scholarship, it's not political liberalism. What it means is they deny anything supernatural, which means they deny miracles, they deny the resurrection of Jesus, they deny the deity of Jesus, and all of their scholarship is based on coming up with understandings, the best way to understand gospel books, Jesus himself, the beginning of Christianity, assuming that all supernatural is impossible. Now, their scholarship is based on pulling ideas off the top of their heads. It's not based on actual evidence. You remember when we looked at the authorship of the gospel books in that series, we quoted a highly respected liberal scholar, Dr. Gerd Ludemann, who said in one of his books, 3 presuppositions underlying my work are the following. First, the authors of the 4 Gospels of the New Testament are not known. Second, the authors were not eyewitnesses. And we pointed out at the time the meaning of the word presupposition. It's something that is accepted as being true, although there's no evidence for it. So here's this highly respected liberal scholar admitting that he simply presupposes that the books were anonymous and that the authors were not eyewitnesses. Robert Funk of the Jesus Seminar, along with the other editors of what they call the 5 Gospel, also wrote that the Gospels are now assumed to be narratives in which the memory of Jesus is embellished by mythic elements that express the church's faith in him and by plausible fictions. And again here, assumed, no evidence, simply assumed.
Surely some must have offered some evidence.
Bauer offered no evidence for these dates that he assigned to the gospel books. Bauer was influenced by the philosophy of Georg Hegel, as the most influential philosopher of that era. He had this view of history that dealt with the status quo, we call the thesis, and whatever the status quo is gives rise to an antithesis, an antithesis that's in opposition to the thesis, and then there's a struggle between the two until they merge into a new synthesis. That synthesis becomes the thesis, gives rise to new antithesis, struggles, and so on. So there's this constant cycle of struggle and development. It was this kind of philosophy that was actually at the basis of Marxism and of Darwinism. And Bauer was very influenced by this philosophy. He decided that Christianity, as we know it, developed from a long struggle between Petrine, or Jewish Christianity, and Pauline, or Gentile Christianity. That Peter taught one thing, which is what the historical Jesus taught. Paul came in with a different message, and the two of them struggled with each other. And people like Luke and then whoever wrote John tried to synthesize the two. This was his view. It was not based on any evidence, of course, but it was his view. And everything he claimed then about the history of Christianity was hammered into this view of his.
Surely anybody who reads the New Testament would know that that is wrong, because Peter and Paul preach the same thing, and Luke is also recording the same message.
Well, you'd be surprised. Many of them do pick and choose and cherry pick different verses to try to make them look like they're against each other. But that's called massaging the evidence. For example, you might have heard the claim from liberal scholars that only 4 of Paul's letters were actually written by Paul: Romans, Galatians, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And that is still scholarly orthodoxy to this day. And they try to cook up reasons for it based on vocabulary and style, which are bogus reasons. But where it actually came from was Bauer. But in Bauer's view, Paul was pugnacious. Paul was always ready to attack his critics and fight. And so any letter in which he seemed to be fighting, like Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, was from Paul. And any letter that was Irenic, that didn't involve this kind of attitude, well, it has to be a forgery. And that is really no basis And yet today, as I said, it's scholarly orthodoxy and in liberal circles that only these three are authentic. And I wonder how many of the people who claim that have any idea that this idea originated with Bauer's own personal views of how Christianity developed, not on the basis of any evidence.
Even if someone does not know how it originated, it still made no sense to me, because here you're making Paul a complex character, like any human being, to be one-dimensional, can only have one emotion and only write one kind of thing. That's totally not realistic.
I agree with you on that. I think Bauer's approach was a complete non-starter. It was not critical, it was not historical, it was not scientific, although the scholars like to present it that way. What he said was basically fiction. It was a fairy tale. But hey, he's from Tübingen, and there's the ethos of the day that wants to discredit the New Testament, and so his views were accepted. They were considered definitive, and that's how liberal scholarship worked, and that's how it has worked and continues to work up to this day.
Wait, when you say it was accepted, by who? Were they accepted by people who really believe Jesus as Christ?
I doubt that most of these professors and intellectuals were actually Christians in terms of having saving faith in Jesus. Most of them were not. But this is the thing. They were the professors. They were the intellectuals. They must know what they're talking about. I think for a long time across the board, ordinary Christians, lay Christians, had no idea of these debates going on at all, or these ideas being floated, particularly in North America. A lot of this was going on in Europe, mostly starting in Germany, German states, and then France and Britain. And the New Testament was being undermined. So was the Old Testament. And most of the Christians here in North America were completely unaware of it. But what it does do is it seeps into the seminaries and into the universities. And these are the people who train the pastors. Now, the pastors may come in and have genuine faith, but when they hear these kind of claims and they hear that these are based on scientific analysis, that these are assured results of scholarship, they tend not to question them. They tend to accept them and then try to bend their view in such a way that they can continue to hold on to their faith, but their view of the Bible becomes quite warped. And that's the problem, as we'll see, not so much what liberals are saying. We expect those people to be against the Bible. The real problem is how many evangelical scholars have bought into this. So there they go. It became official. Matthew was dated to 130, Luke to 150, Mark to 160. And then in 1844, Bauer wrote that the Gospel, according to John, was written as a synthesis of Petrine and Pauline Christianity, and therefore could be dated no earlier than the year AD 160, but probably closer to AD 170. This was what they called the assured results of critical scholarship. It was accepted across the board by scholars, and you couldn't question it because this is scholarship.
But it was baseless. Do they still make those claims?
No, it did finally collapse. And it's quite interesting how that happened. It all came down to a small scrap of papyrus, old document, very small piece of one, actually, a fragment, that had been in storage at the John Rylands Library in England ever since somebody picked it up in the Middle East in the year 1920. It was not actually studied until 1935 when a papyrologist named Colin H. Roberts took a look at it and realized that it was actually a piece from the Gospel according to John, specifically several verses from chapter 18. Now it had been studied by a number of experts, and now they took another look at it after Roberts identified it, and they dated it to the year somewhere between AD 110 and 135. Could have been earlier, as early as 98 perhaps. And eventually they began closing in on around the year AD 100, though more recently now liberal scholars are again trying to move the date of this manuscript later.
How did they date it?
They dated what's called paleographically, and paleographic just means old writing. Different scribes who would copy these manuscripts by hand had different styles of writing, and it would vary from era to era, and that still happens. If you look at the handwriting of somebody today compared to the handwriting of somebody in, say, the Civil War times, you will notice it's very, very different. And so scholars have collected many, many samples of ancient manuscripts from different periods, many of which include a date inside the document itself. And so we know when that came from. And so they've built up this ladder essentially of different writing styles in the different eras. And it's not so precise that you could get it down to an exact year, but you get a reasonable estimate of the date at which a manuscript was copied by the writing style.
Why couldn't they date it by carbon-14 dating?
Well, one obvious reason was carbon-14 dating hadn't been invented yet. That was invented by Libby in the 1940s. Secondly, there are a lot of problems with carbon dating. There's a lot of unknowns, assumptions you need to make, and so on. It's a destructive testing process as well. You have to actually destroy some of the sample in order to test it. Now, recently we've developed better methods that are not so destructive, but so in those days they were. But the big problem is you can only date if you ignore the problems intrinsic to radiometric dating, the other big problem is you can only date the material it's written on and not the writing itself.
Wouldn't they be about the same?
Not necessarily. They could actually be very different, and there's no way to know. Consider the very important manuscript that's called Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. And this is codex, that means it's in a book form, not a scroll. And on this manuscript are Greek translations of 38 treatises written by a 4th century theologian named Ephraim the Syrian. And these treatises were copied onto the parchment material that the document is made out of in the 12th century. Now, rescriptus means rewritten. Why? Well, because parchment, vellum, the top quality writing material of the day was very expensive. And so you'd often actually reuse it. You take your piece of parchment, you'd wash off the original writing, and then write something new on top of it. When you find a manuscript like that, it's called a palimpsest. And that was the case here with Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. Underneath the treatises, scholars identified a copy of the New Testament, missing a couple of books, but most of it there, some books from the Old Testament as well. And this earlier writing came from the 5th century. The upper writing then on this palimpsest was at least 7 centuries younger than the parchment. So if somebody had just taken the manuscript, did a carbon-14 dating on it, dated it to the 5th century, they would assume that the writing on top was also from the 5th century, when in fact it came from 7 centuries later. So no, you can't assume that the writing has the same date as the material, and so carbon-14 dating is generally not used to date manuscripts.
Okay, but if you wash out the writing, are you saying that you can see the writing from centuries ago that was washed off on the vellum?
You could see it because it's difficult, certainly with their washing, to get rid of all of it. The ink would seep into the lower layers of the parchment. And yeah, you couldn't completely excise it. Now when we use ultraviolet light on it, we can see all kinds of stuff underneath that we couldn't see before.
Very interesting. So Roberts found a piece from the Gospel according to John that dated to AD 100 to 135. Why was that so significant?
Well, think about it. Remember that F.C. Bauer told us that the Gospel according to John could be dated no earlier than AD 160, but probably closer to AD 170. And he told us that this was the assured results of critical scholarship. Assured results mean you can't question it. This is what all the scholars accepted, the professors. This is what we're told. This is certain. You can't question it. Now, suddenly, a manuscript from the Gospel according to John comes along, dated somewhere between 100 and 135. So which came first, AD 135 or AD 160?
I see. So this was hard evidence that Bauer's dates were wrong.
Spectacularly so. And remember, we were told AD 160 at the earliest, the assured results of critical scholarship, and now they're blown out of the water. They're clearly wrong. What should this have done to the credibility of so-called critical scholarship?
Well, it should have demolished it, and people should understand that these scholars don't always know what they're talking about just because they're professors in universities.
Exactly. Those claims of Bauer were never built on substance. It was picked up by people who wanted to go along with it and help discredit the New Testament. And now the least bit of hard evidence came along that destroyed its assured result. So it should have demolished liberal scholarship. Nobody should be taking it seriously.
It wasn't demolished, was it?
No, it's sadly to say it wasn't. There are too many people with a vested interest in discrediting the New Testament, and they're quite shameless about this. They would go on to their next view and again present it as the assured results of critical scholarship. They would make these other assertions with equal confidence and equal lack of evidence. It is their stock in trade to this day. Their claims continue to be published, widely disseminated in news magazines and TV documentaries. Now, you'll see them in Time Magazine, Newsweek, Maclean's, and so on. And those who read such articles carefully and pay attention see that all you ever find in these articles are bald assertions. But the assertions are made by people who have doctrine in front of their name, people who are professors, they're touted as experts. And so people tend to just accept what's there, even though they never see actual evidence for the claims.
Really, there's nothing new under the sun. I can see such things happening today in front of our eyes. But still, the discovery of P52 must have done something to Bauer's late-date claims.
Oh, certainly. With the Gospel according to John being the last one published and having to have been published before this P52 copy was made, liberal scholars were forced to concede that all of the Gospel books were in fact published in the first century.
That's huge. That means it is not possible to remove them from eyewitness times.
Exactly. Jesus died, rose, and ascended to heaven in the year AD 33. So from there to the end of the century is 67 years. So the maximum possible date of a gospel book would be 67 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And even that, 67 years, sounds like a long time, but it is well within eyewitness memory. Liberal skeptics, of course, want to emphasize that this is such a long period of time. How could people possibly remember accurately over such a long period of time? And they want to cast the impression that you really can't trust something written long after the time. But the reality is that the older one gets, the farther back he can remember. Certainly significant events, and maybe not what he ate for breakfast on a particular day 50 years ago, but significant events, like say a wedding, they can remember that. For me at my age, I can remember back at least 50 years, no problem. My mom can remember back 75 to 80 years. And still, though, people don't think about that. They tend to hear, oh, the gospel books were in 30 years later, 40 years later, 65 years later, and they think, hey, yeah, people can't remember, but they can.
I see a bit of a problem here, though. Assuming the eyewitnesses were adults, 67 years later will make them really old. Do people live that long in those days?
Yes. People have this idea that lifespans were much shorter in the days of the Roman Empire than they are now. And they're correct about that if you're looking at the average. But the average is brought down. It's much shorter because so many infants died at a young age and children at a young age. Child mortality was very high compared to today. So was death in childbirth, and of course, those in the military. But those people who avoided these threats could expect to live about as long as we do today. From the first century BC onwards, 60 or 65 is frequently mentioned as the common threshold of old age in those days. Polycarp, we mentioned him before, Polycarp died as a martyr in the year 155 or 156, and he told his captors that he'd served Christ for 86 years. Robert K. McIver, in his book Memory, Jesus, and the Synoptic Gospels, estimates that there were potentially 60,000 eyewitnesses of Jesus, and 30 years later, 18 to 20,000 of them would still be around. And even after 60 years, he says, anywhere from 600 to 1,100 would still have been around.
So even if the liberal skeptics push the dates of the gospel books to as late as possible, as long as they're in the first century, they are still in the time of eyewitnesses.
Yes. Nevertheless, as I pointed out, the later they claim the books are, the more people may get the impression that they're not reliable. So they do try to late date the gospel books as much as possible.
So what do they now claim are the dates at which the gospel books were published?
The dates they now claim as the so-called scholarly consensus is that Mark is the earliest canonical gospel, published around the year AD 70, and certainly not earlier than 66. Matthew and Luke, they say, were published sometime in the AD 80s, and John in the 90s.
How did they come up with these dates?
Well, the answer to that question really exposes how liberal scholarship works. You see, liberal scholars believe that the gospel according to Mark was the first one. They're wrong about that, actually. The evidence that Matthew was the first is overwhelming, so much so that even that arch-liberal F.C. Bauer didn't question it. He had Matthew as his first gospel book. But we'll look at this at another time. They believe that Mark was first, and it was published in the year AD 70. Ask me why they picked that date.
Why did they pick that date?
Here's why. Listen to this passage, Mark chapter 13, verses 1 to 2. Then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." And Jesus answered and said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down."
That's Jesus' prophecy that the temple will be utterly destroyed. It was fulfilled exactly, as I recall, even the unexpected detail that not one stone would be left on another.
When was it fulfilled?
The year AD 70?
Indeed. And that makes it supernatural proof for Jesus. He prophesied what would happen, and it came to pass decades later. But remember that liberal scholars rule out the possibility of anything supernatural, so they discount the possibility that Jesus could genuinely have foretold the future. What does that mean? It means this must have been written after the fact. Dr. Gerd Ludemann, in his book, What Jesus Didn't Say, says this, quote, "The clear allusion to the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred some 40 years after Jesus' death, also makes it obvious that Jesus cannot have told this tale." Well, it's only obvious if we believe Jesus could not foretell the future. But that is not a fact. It is not based on science or any objective basis. It is simply their own bias, their own anti-supernatural bias. But since it is their bias, they cannot accept that Jesus foretold the future. And so they say Mark, which includes this prophecy, must have been published after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And so there you go. Mark couldn't have been published before AD 70.
So there is no actual evidence, only that they, based on their assumption, they set the dates to AD 70.
No actual evidence. And you're welcome to check out their books to see that. You will find the dates being asserted. But other than this claim about the prophecy, you really won't find anything else. It's based on presuppositions. I remember one time in our Bible study group, we had a guest over, for one of the studies. He was a fellow studying at a liberal Protestant seminary associated with the University of Toronto. And he'd been well versed in these claims of liberal scholarship. And we decided that we would have an impromptu, informal debate in that session. And I told him, though, before we started, that he cannot appeal to the prophecy and say that the book had to be after because Jesus couldn't foretell the future. Because I pointed out, this is simply metaphysical bias. It's not fact. And he looked at me like a deer caught in the headlights. And he said, but that's all we've got. And in the end, we didn't end up having the debate because that was really all they had. Now, I should note, though, they might be willing to go back a little further, little earlier than AD 70, as long as they can do it without having to accord supernatural knowledge to Jesus. They might go back as far as the year AD 66, which is the year that the Jewish revolt against the Romans began. And they would say at that point, a prescient person could see the destruction of Jerusalem coming.
What about the other gospel books?
Well, they believe, and again wrongly, that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. What they mean essentially is that they copied from Mark. Well, if they copied from Mark, then they had to come later than Mark, so they put Matthew and Luke into the 80s. John is last, and they say, oh, it's so theological. He has such a high view of Jesus. He's portraying the deity of Jesus. And they say it had to be very late before such ideas developed. So they pushed John into the 90s, 95 or 96.
What about the evangelicals? Do they agree with the dates given by the liberal scholars?
Well, the evangelical position on this is decidedly a mixed bag. Some evangelical commentators actually sound no different from liberals. According to one recent commentary, Mark was published in AD 66 to 68 because, get this, the description of the destruction matches what happened in the earlier part of the Jewish war. So that's what the author would have seen at the time. But, says this author, some elements of Jesus' prophecy were actually not fulfilled. So if the author were writing after AD 70, he would not have put those in.
How exactly is that different from the liberal position?
I don't actually see a difference. If anything, it seems to me even more extreme.
But surely not all evangelical commentators would teach such things.
No, of course not. But their views tend to be problematic nevertheless.
How?
For one thing, virtually all of them accept without question that Mark was written first. This is actually a huge problem, and we will discuss it in another program. Now, on the other hand, most of them do believe that Jesus could foretell the future, so they do not accept that Mark had to be published in AD 70 or 66 or later. On the contrary, they argue correctly that Mark records this prophecy of the destruction of the temple, but does not record the fulfillment of the prophecy, which they say would certainly have been recorded if it had happened by the time of writing. So, in contradistinction to the liberal position, they would say that AD 70 is the latest possible date for Mark instead of the earliest. And so their dates for Matthew, Mark, and Luke are earlier than what liberal scholars claim. But here's where it gets weird. They do move back from the extreme dates, but not by much. They still date the books decades after the event and for no apparent reason.
Really?
Yes. One seminary standard textbook, it's the one that I actually used when I was in seminary, it purports to examine the evidence and concludes that Mark was published in the late 50s. Their reason? Well, they say that Luke was published in the year 60, and Mark must already have been there since they claim Luke copied from Mark. So if Luke was published in 60, then Mark must be from the late 50s. Do you see a problem with that?
Yes, the obvious one. If Mark was published before AD 60, that could put it any time from AD 33 to AD 59. There's no reason to push it to the late 50s.
Exactly. I can't help but think they are influenced by liberal scholarship on this, starting with the liberal dates and then moving back from there instead of starting with a fresh look at the evidence. Now, they do attempt to justify not putting Mark into the 40s, but it is a dismal failure.
What do they say?
Here it is, quote, "So early a date for Mark's gospel makes it hard to explain the silence of Paul and the other New Testament writers about it, and it does not perhaps allow sufficient time for the development of the tradition behind Mark," unquote. So these two reasons.
Do you find these unconvincing?
Most certainly. The first argument, the supposed silence of Paul and the other New Testament writers, is an argument from silence. And it's worthless unless there's a strong expectation that they should be mentioning it.
And there isn't?
No. After all, consider the Old Testament books. They were certainly written long one after another. But how often do they refer to, let alone quote, earlier books? And if they don't do it, why would we expect the New Testament writers to do so? What these scholars are overlooking is that these early Christian writers quoted from the Bible books for the same reason we pastors quote in our sermons and apologists in our articles. Our words are not God-breathed, and so they have no authority on their own. It is the scripture we have to appeal to for authority, and we quote the scripture to show that what we are saying is based on that. But the New Testament writers seem to understand that they were writing scripture. It was independently authoritative, and so they had no need to refer to other Bible books, Mark or any others.
Okay, that sounds fair. Any other reason?
Well, the other reason that they give is actually far more troubling, if you ask me. You recall they reject the date for Mark in the 40s because, quote, "it does not perhaps allow sufficient time for the development of the tradition behind Mark," unquote.
What does that really mean, tradition behind Mark?
Well, you've identified the problem here. Evangelicals have always understood, and the evidence supports this, that the gospel books were written individually by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John under the influence of the Holy Spirit so that they wrote God-breathed scripture. Matthew and John, apostles, were writing their own memoirs, so to speak, their own memories about Jesus. Mark was writing down Peter's own testimony. Now, liberal scholars reject this, of course. And they don't accept anything supernatural, so they do not accept that the New Testament books could be God-breathed. They believe, instead, that a bunch of oral traditions about Jesus developed through the years after Jesus and before the books were written. These are of unknown origin. Nobody knows who made up the traditions. No one can identify authors of the traditions. And they say that these traditions circulated and developed for decades. And then the gospel writers, whoever they were, collected them and arranged them and edited them, changed them into the gospel books we have today. So when our evangelicals are rejecting the 40s because it does not perhaps allow sufficient time for the development of the tradition behind Mark, which view are they actually going with?
So it sounds like they already made up their mind how the gospel books come about, and then they try to fit the dates to what they have already in mind. That's what it sounds like to me.
Yes, they've rejected the correct evangelical position that each author wrote independently under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and they've accepted the liberal position that, in fact, these books were based on oral traditions that had developed and floated around for decades.
Still, does it matter if the first gospel book was published in the late 50s? Sure, that's a quarter century after the death and resurrection of Jesus, but as you pointed out, it's still within eyewitness times.
Yes. But again, to most people, 25 years seems like such a long time that it is easy to induce them into thinking that this makes the gospel books unreliable. And it is not the only problem when it comes to the dates of the gospel books.
What are the other problems?
I can sum it up by an assertion on the matter from a functionary of a popular apologetics ministry that focuses on creationism, but often addresses other matters. Here's the statement, and I quote, "The accounts in the Gospels are neither the only nor the earliest evidence we have of Christian writing about the resurrection. That honor goes to 1 Thessalonians, one of the earliest of Paul's letters, which was written around AD 50. So we have evidence that about 2 decades after Christ's death, there was a group of people who insisted he was raised from the dead and had built a decent portion of their theology around that fact, which doesn't happen overnight. But the gospel accounts were penned decades after the events they describe," unquote. Specifically, she says the gospel books were penned from AD 55 to 85, and she says they go back to early oral tradition. Do you see the problem here?
Well, to me, that would seem the gospel accounts may be inaccurate when you pass from person to person by oral tradition over so many years. We all know that without written document and just oral tradition, a lot of things can change.
Yes, and again, that has not been the evangelical view. That is the liberal view, and yet you see evangelical apologists accepting without question these liberal claims. And what happens now? The picture that results from what this person has written is that, get this, the earliest evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus is that a group of people who were not eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus, living in a city in the Hellenic world far from Israel, about 2 decades after Christ's death, insisted that Jesus was raised from the dead because they had been told that by another man who was himself not an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. How convincing is that?
Well, that will open up to a lot of questions about the accuracy, and that the whole thing about Jesus' death, people can question it because none of that was from eyewitness accounts.
Yes, it becomes incalculably weaker than having the gospel books at an early date with eyewitness testimony being the earliest evidence we have.
But still, we do have the gospel books, even if they weren't published until AD 55 and later.
Yeah, but we are told that these were based on oral traditions of unknown origin floating around and developing for decades before they were put to paper. So how do we know if they were credible at all?
I think if you believe in oral tradition floating around, you cannot believe that they are credible or accurate at all. But they were written by apostles or their representatives.
Then it would be a different story. But liberal scholars deny that, of course. And they would ask, why? If they were written by apostles, why did they have to use oral traditions floating around and developing instead of their own memories? So certainly attaching such late dates to the gospel books as AD 55 and after, and appealing to oral tradition weakens the credibility of the gospel books. And there is more.
What is that?
This schema opens the door for liberal skeptics, and for that matter, Muslim apologists. Dr. Shabir Ali is one who has forcefully acted on this. It opens the door to them to claim that Paul actually invented Christianity, that Paul, based on nothing but personal visions, came up with the idea of the resurrection and salvation by grace alone through faith alone and other such things. And he spread this, and it spread and became so accepted that by the time the gospel authors got around to writing, they incorporated these Pauline elements into their works.
That's disastrous. It totally undermines the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, nobody can believe it if that's how it came about. But what can we do if that's what the evidence shows?
Well, that's the key question then, isn't it? Does the evidence actually show that? And the answer is a resounding no. It is, in fact, quite careless to accept such dating schemes, even when they're tweaked here and there by evangelicals. It is very careless to accept them instead of reviewing from ground up the actual evidence and reach our conclusions on that basis.
So we've reached the point when we examine evidence, right?
Right.
So what is the evidence that bears on this question?
There are actually two lines or two types of evidence for such a question, what we call internal evidence and external evidence.
Can you explain that?
Internal evidence is evidence that comes from what is stated within the writing itself, if indeed there are comments or statements within the document that allow us to narrow down the possible date of composition. For external evidence, there are different types. One is such things as the manuscripts themselves. You remember we mentioned how in that manuscript P52 was found, which dated at latest AD 135, it proved that the extreme late dating favored by liberal scholars was bogus, and they were forced to recant that. Well, so if you have a piece of hard evidence like that, that would set the latest possible date of composition of that writing at the year 135. However, this really doesn't help us because this is the oldest New Testament manuscript we have about there, so that really doesn't help us to set the dates. Unless, of course, we consider this one tiny manuscript fragment that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls that a scholar named Jose O'Callaghan identified as being from the Gospel according to Mark. And he identified it after it was dated to the year AD 50 at the latest. Now, that would be very significant because it would set the latest date of composition from Mark as being the year AD 50. However, since almost all New Testament scholars reject this identification, they say it wasn't really from Mark, so I'm not going to actually adduce that one. The other type is commentary or facts about the origins of the gospel books that were recorded by people in a position to know. There were actually a lot of Christian writers, leaders in the church, people we tend to call the early church fathers or church fathers, who wrote reams of commentary and other kinds of documentary evidence about the gospel books. And if they who are in a position to know, because they might have known the apostles or known the gospel writers, what they say about how and when these books were written is quite definitive. And sometimes it's a combination. Sometimes one of these church fathers would comment on something in the text that helps to narrow down the dating. And we actually have a considerable amount of evidence, both external, internal, and a combination for the dating of the gospel books.
Shouldn't all this evidence settle the matter?
It should. But remember, liberal scholarship was never about finding the actual answers, but about discrediting the New Testament. You remember F.C. Bauer simply waved his wand and proclaimed by fiat that the first gospel book was published exactly 100 years after Jesus' death. So they're not really looking for the true answer. When they address the early church fathers' data at all, it is to disparage it, except in the rare cases where they think they can use it to help their case. You might remember when we talked about the testimony of Josephus, liberal scholars tried to discredit it by saying that Josephus was not a Christian, and he's not a Christian, and so he wouldn't write these things about Jesus. How did they know he's not a Christian? Well, they had to appeal to the early church fathers. So when it helps them, then the early church fathers are reliable. Otherwise, they're not. But when it comes to discrediting the books, they demonstrate some rather amazing chutzpah.
I'm just wondering, since Bauer can just wave his wand and declare this and that, why can't people with the truth behind their claims wave a wand of truth and let people believe it?
Well, we could, but then it comes down to credibility. Remember, these are the people who have the professorships. These are the ones with the PhDs. These are the ones who have doctor in front of their name. And unfortunately, that gives them a patina of authority. Very often, most cases, in fact, they don't need to give evidence. They simply have to go I have a PhD, trust me, routine on these.
Are you saying that there are no scholars with PhDs and titles that have the evidence and be able to argue against these other magic wand waving professors?
They do, but they don't. They have the qualifications. They don't argue against them. They tend to accept these. We'll go over this in more detail in another series. But the fact is the liberals got there first. The liberals gained control of these various institutions of higher learning, the universities, the seminaries. And we talked about that time in the Enlightenment where that was the desire among the intelligentsia. So once they're there first, the evangelicals who go to study are sitting under the teachings of these people. And these people are the ones with the PhDs. They're the ones you're paying money to hear. And you yourself don't actually know the facts. And so the tendency is just to accept it. And that's why, as we've been looking at the dating, we've seen in how many ways evangelicals tend to go along with what liberals have to say on these things and just don't challenge them.
Okay, you did mention something about discrediting the books, demonstrating amazing chutzpah. How so?
Well, there was a unanimous agreement among all scholars, even among the most extreme liberals, that the gospel according to Matthew was the first one written. The evidence for this is so strong that it was universally accepted. Even F.C. Bauer accepted it. There was no basis to challenge it. But certain manuscript discoveries in the 19th century opened up a very promising new means to undermine the resurrection of Jesus, but it would only work if the gospel according to Mark was the first one published. So all that large amount of evidence for Matthew being first was summarily dismissed. And in what was really short order in an academic sense, Markan priority, the belief that Mark was the first one written, became scholarly orthodoxy. Now that was bad enough, but here's the chutzpah. As a bonus, once they decided Mark was first, they then turned and said, hey, look, the early church fathers got the order wrong, so we shouldn't really trust them on the rest of the things they say.
What about the evangelical scholars? How did they utilize the evidence from the early Christians?
Sadly, as I said, not as well as they should. In that seminary standard textbook that I mentioned earlier, the authors survey the possible dates for Mark. When they look at the 40s, there's no real mention about that. They do mention this little manuscript fragment I mentioned, 7Q5 from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they simply write it off saying most scholars have contested it. And then they say, even if it were valid, it would prove only the existence of, at this date, of tradition that came to be incorporated into Mark. So here again, they're accepting that highly problematic view that Mark was not the direct eyewitness testimony of Peter. It was something based on earlier oral traditions floating around and developing. And so here, if you had this actual piece of external evidence, this manuscript, they say, well, it would only prove the existence of the traditions. Well, really, we have no evidence for supposed traditions floating around beforehand, let alone being written down. We do have evidence for the gospel according to Mark. So why would they take this piece of evidence and redefine it into something that's not known ever to have existed, written traditions? Unfortunately, this is one of those things that a famous doctor once said, the very powerful and the very stupid have one thing in common. They don't alter their views to fit the facts. They alter the facts to fit their views. And I don't think this applies only to the very powerful and the very stupid. I'm not accusing them of that. It's just a human tendency. Okay? We know of Mark. We don't know of written traditions that came to be incorporated in Mark. So why do we then suggest that that's what it would show? And then they don't look at any evidence from the early church fathers for a date that would be in the 40s. Then regarding the suggestion that Mark was written in the 50s, they argue that it was not likely that Peter was in Rome in the early 40s, but he was in the 50s. But the only basis for that is that Eusebius, who was one of the church fathers who was writing in the early 4th century, Eusebius implies that Peter was in Rome during the reign of Claudius, who died in 54. And that is the only appeal made to anything from the early church fathers.
But at least that is an appeal to external evidence, isn't it?
Yes, but in this case, it is absolutely useless.
Why?
Well, Eusebius says, he doesn't imply, he actually says that Peter was in Rome during the reign of Claudius. And yes, Claudius died in AD 54, but Claudius began his reign in AD 41. So yes, you could be in Rome during the reign of Claudius and be in the early 40s. So this information from Eusebius does not favor the 50s over the 40s. And why these scholars overlook that is not clear to me at all. And then next they consider the 60s. And again here, the only appeal made to the early church fathers is to claim that, quote, the earliest traditions favor a date for Mark after the death of Peter. And they cite for this some external evidence, the so-called anti-Marcionite prologue, which they suggest goes to the late 2nd century. But they put a question mark in there because some scholars date it as late as the 4th century. They appeal as well to an early church father in the latter part of the 2nd century who was named Irenaeus. And they say perhaps Papias, who writes that Mark had been Peter's interpreter. So it's only once they get to the looking at the date in the 60s that the authors actually look at the early church fathers and they say it supports this date, but then the authors opt for the late 50s instead. And they say dating Mark in the 50s does go against the earliest traditions about Mark having been written after the death of Peter, but other traditions affirm that Mark was still alive. So the early evidence is by no means unanimous on the subject. And for this, he cites Clement of Alexandria and perhaps Tertullian, while dropping the surprise that Irenaeus may not have been talking about the death of Peter, but about his departure from Rome.
That sounds like a rather confused jumble to me.
I can't disagree with that. There's a mix of liberal views about Mark here being based on traditions, mixed with an appeal to some early church fathers, but missing some rather crucial other ones, along with other external evidence. And the only internal evidence the authors consider is that Acts must have been written in 62, they say, which puts Luke earlier. The authors say AD 60. And so Mark must have been in the late 50s. So it is very inadequate and reaches wrong conclusions. Yet most evangelical books and articles will go along with these dates because they tend to just pass them on from one to another. Evangelical scholars do not, as we may mistakenly assume, check the evidence for themselves. They just accept what they hear from others.
It seems like the way they use evidence is they cherry pick whatever that fits their theory. If Acts was published in AD 62, then Luke must be earlier. But how do we know it was in 60? It could have been any time before AD 62.
Yes, it could have been. That's the problem. If we say that Mark was before 60, well, it could have been anywhere, essentially from 33 up to 60. Why would we say it would have to be in the 50s? Could have been, and was actually published well before AD 60.
But did they give actual reasons for dating Luke to 60 rather than earlier?
No. Here too, they listed arguments for various dates and then admitted that the arguments were subjective. And no, they did not appeal to any external evidence.
Okay, can we do better? Can we use all the data to determine the best estimates of the dates at which the gospel books were published?
Yes, by looking carefully at all of the internal and external evidence. Now, regarding the latter, regarding the external evidence, the authors in this textbook did correctly point out that sometimes the early church fathers do say conflicting things. They were not writing God-breathed scripture. They're not infallible. And so in such cases, we have to assess conflicting data to make the best choice.
Okay, let's do it.
All right, let's start with the internal evidence.
Can you remind us of what that is and how it works?
Yes, internal evidence, as I said, is based on things written in the document. And it could be something that's there or something that should be there that's not there. An example of something that's there. Suppose you're reading a writing that mentions the sending of a telegram. Well, you know that this writing had to have come after May 24th, 1844, because that's the date at which the first telegram was sent. So any document talking about the sending of a telegram has to come from after that date. Or suppose you read in a document that the Anaheim Ducks are the reigning Stanley Cup champions. Well, you could pin that writing down to somewhere between June 6, 2007 and June 4th, 2008. The Ducks won only one Stanley Cup championship, and that was on June 6, 2007. Anything before that would not refer to them as the Stanley Cup champs. The next season, Detroit Red Wings won it on June 4th, 2008. So anything after that date would not have referred to the Ducks as the Stanley Cup champions. And sometimes you figure out from a variety of points. I remember there was an old Archie comic. And this was a reprint. You know, Archie's been around since 1941, and they published these digests with reprints from all different eras. How do you know when they came from? There was one in which one panel, the character Veronica says, "What did Jock Mahoney say when he saw the elephants coming down the trail?" And from that one comment, we could date this comic somewhere between 1962 and 1966, into that 4-year window.
How?
Well, there was an era when it was popular to make really stupid elephant jokes. I don't know why, but there were. There were jokes like, how do you know when an elephant is hiding in your refrigerator? The answer is you can't close the door. And then they would have they would have some that were couplets, where the second was a little bit funnier. What do elephants like to do for fun? They like to jump out of trees. But then the next one is, why is it dangerous to go into the jungle between 2 and 4 in the afternoon? Answer, because that's when elephants are jumping out of trees. One of them was, what did Tarzan say when he saw the elephants coming down the trail? And the answer is, here come the elephants down the trail. Followed by, what did Tarzan say when he saw the elephants coming down the trail wearing sunglasses? Answer, nothing, he couldn't recognize them. Very stupid jokes. But in this particular case, that's what Veronica's saying, but instead of saying Tarzan, she put in Jock Mahoney. Well, Mahoney was an actor who played Tarzan. His first movie was in 1962. He played in 2 movies, 1962 and 1963. There was not another Tarzan movie released until 1966 with a new actor. So anytime you're going to substitute Jock Mahoney for Tarzan, it has to be between 1962 and 1966. So this is what we mean by internal evidence, things that are written inside that allow us to date the documents. The other form of internal evidence is where there's something not mentioned that should be mentioned.
Isn't that an argument from silence, which is a weak argument?
Well, an argument from silence is not necessarily weak. It depends on how strong is the expectation that it should be there. For example, suppose a murder is being committed and a suspect is arrested. The murder happened at 8:30 p.m. on Friday night. The suspect is asked, where were you 8:30 p.m. Friday night? And he says, I was at the Blue Jays game. So the police drag 5 witnesses who were at the game, and they ask him, did you see this man there? And they say, no. Would you consider, and they say, see, they didn't see you there. You weren't there. You're lying. Would you consider that a reasonable argument?
No.
Why not?
Well, so many people at the game, they may not even notice that person.
Exactly. If there's 20, 30, 40,000 people in the arena, why would you, in the stadium, why would you notice this one person? But if the suspect said, I was the starting pitcher at the Blue Jay game, and the 5 witnesses said, no, we didn't see him, then would it be a strong argument?
Yes.
Yes, if he's the starting pitcher, you would expect to see him. So an argument from silence can be weak or it can be strong, depends on the expectation that it should be mentioned if it actually happened.
Can you give us an example of a strong argument from silence?
Sure. Suppose you're reading an article about the World Trade Center, and this article talks about when it was built, what it's used for, and other details about it, but makes no mention of its destruction. Then you can be sure that article was written sometime before 9/11/2001.
True. So is there such internal evidence in the gospel books that allow us to date them?
There's actually quite a number that allow us to narrow down the possible dates.
Which ones?
Well, let's revisit the one we've already mentioned, the one that's adduced by both sides. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Roman armies in the year 70. You remember that the Jews rose up in rebellion in the year 66. And after 4 years of fighting, the Romans penetrated into Jerusalem, destroyed the city, killed a lot of people, and destroyed the temple. And this, as we mentioned, was foretold by Jesus. It's recorded in Matthew, in Mark, and in Luke. And this is why liberals will not allow the first gospel book, the first of these 3, to come before the year 70, or at most 66, because liberals don't believe Jesus could have foretold the future. Okay? But that's begging the question, of course, as we mentioned. Okay? The real question for us is this. If it had been fulfilled by the time of writing, as the liberals claim, would the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, would they have mentioned the fact that this prophecy came true?
I think so. So important as an event.
I agree. Let's consider this, for example. In Acts chapter 11, verse 28, we read, then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. So here's a relatively minor character, Agabus, giving a relatively minor prophecy about a famine, and yet the book explicitly records its fulfillment. Now, Luke, meanwhile, who wrote Acts and also wrote the Gospel according to Luke, actually starts his Gospel book this way. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us. So again, if he's talking about things fulfilled, you would expect that he would mention the fulfillment of that prophecy, because he does tend to focus on such things. In chapter 1 of Luke, the angel Gabriel foretells the birth of John the Baptist to his father Zacharias. And Zacharias, when he expresses some doubt, we read this in verses 19 to 20, and the angel answered and said to him, I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and was sent to speak to you and bring you these glad tidings. But behold, you will be mute and not able to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their own time. Then later we see in verses 59 to 63, so it was on the 8th day that they came to circumcise the child, and they would have called him by the name of his father, Zacharias. His mother answered and said, no, he shall be called John. But they said to her, there's no one among your relatives who is called by this name. So they made signs to his father what he would have him called. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, saying, his name is John. So they all marveled. And after that, he was able to speak. So the prophecy about Zacharias is recorded, and so is the fulfillment of the prophecy. So considering that this is Luke's approach, the reasonable conclusion is that if the destruction of the temple had happened by the time of the writing of the book, it would have been specified that Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled.
So that is good internal evidence. Is that what you call it?
Yes. And that puts Luke before the year AD 70. And since Matthew and Mark came before Luke, all three of these books come before the year AD 70.
What about the gospel according to John?
Well, John doesn't actually mention Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple. So it's not so simple in this case. We'll deal with the date of John after we go through the dates for Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Okay, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all before AD 70. Anything else?
Yes, indeed. Notice that in Acts chapter 7, we read of the tragic death of the deacon Stephen, who again is a relatively minor character. In Acts chapter 12, verses 1 to 2, we read this. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. James is a more significant character than Stephen, but not as much as Peter and Paul. Now, if Acts records the death of Stephen and of James, do you think it would record the deaths of Paul and Peter if they had happened by the time the book was written?
For sure.
Yes. And based on external evidence, best evidence we have, it seems that Paul died in the year 68, Peter in the year 64 during that first persecution from Nero. But the book of Acts doesn't mention either of these. So what conclusion can we draw from that?
That Acts was published before AD 64.
Yes, and we confirm that up. In Acts 8:1, we read this. Now Saul was consenting to his death. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria except the apostles. And we note also that Jesus warned of persecutions. Now, the first great state-sponsored persecution was started by the Roman Emperor Nero in the year 64. That is also not mentioned. The other persecutions are not this one. So this dovetails with the conclusion we've already reached, that the book was published before the year 64. Can we get more precise still? Yes. There's an interesting feature about the book of Acts. It begins as a third-person narrative, covers a lot of time span in its chapters, and then, partway through the book, it switches for a time to first-person narrative. And the author starts talking about we, these so-called we passages. The first one is in Acts 16:10 to 17, which took place around the year 50. Okay. Now, why does this switch to we? The only reasonable answer is that at this point, the author of the book actually joins Paul's team. He seems to depart, and then back again in Acts chapter 20, verses 5 to 16, and then 21, 1 to 19, and then 27, 1 to 28, 16. It becomes we passages again. And the action in these parts really slows down. Before, many years are being covered per chapter, but now the action has really slowed down. A lot of tiny, fine details are being recorded just as an eyewitness would have seen them. And we ask why? And it's reasonable to conclude that Luke at this point was traveling with Paul. He wrote the history of the church up to that point, and then he continued adding as new things happened. Now, the book ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome, and it was specified he spent 2 years in Rome, which takes us to the year 62. Why does it end there? Okay, why does it end there? Why does he not go on to tell us what actually happened to Paul? And we've all been waiting to see what happened to Paul. We don't find out. And the only reasonable explanation here is that they have no idea when Paul's case will be resolved. Luke doesn't want to wait any further. He wants to publish the book. And so he finishes it and publishes it at this point. It's the only viable reason to explain why the book ends here and why it doesn't tell us what happened to Paul.
So there are a lot of lines of internal evidence converging on this date of AD 60 for Luke. That would be a problem for liberal scholars, wouldn't it?
Indeed, it would. You remember that they put Mark at 70, and since Luke is later, according to their scheme, and in fact, Luke is later, they put Luke into the 80s. And so they have a lot of trouble explaining why these things, the death of Paul, the death of Peter, the persecution under Nero, the things we've mentioned, they have a lot of trouble explaining why the author of the book didn't mention these. And they have a lot of trouble explaining why the book ends where it does, with Paul under house arrest for 2 years, no information on what happened after that, and so on. So how do you get around that? The only dodge I've actually heard, the only attempt they make to explain that, is they say that, well, look, Luke was trying to tell us the story about how the gospel spread from Jerusalem all the way to Rome, the capital of the empire, the heart of the empire. And so that's where he finished the book, where the gospel's gone to Rome and Paul's preaching for 2 years. That's what they wanted to tell us. That's where they finished the book, even though it was actually, they wrote it much later.
Well, that sounds unconvincing to me, because it sounds like when you have an ending to a story and you just chop it off. And so that doesn't make sense.
I agree. It's bogus, actually. It's not even true what they're saying, because Paul is not the one who brought the gospel to Rome. We know from his letter to the Romans, his epistle to the Romans, which was written around 57, that there was already a thriving, world-famous church in Rome long before Paul ever got there. So Paul did not found the church in Rome. So Acts is not telling us how the gospel got to Rome. It doesn't even address that. But what it does is follow, at least in the latter part of the book, it follows the career of Paul. And there's no reason then for cutting it off here, other than this is as far as events had gotten. It was the year AD 62, and Luke decided to go ahead and publish at this point. And furthermore, that dodge doesn't explain why those other things were left out. Now, let me give you one other piece of internal evidence, and this is actually combined with a piece of external evidence. If you look at Paul's letter, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 18, we read this, quote, "And we have sent with him the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches." And it could just as well be translated, the brother whose praise is with reference to the gospel throughout all the churches. And it's a little bit of a cryptic comment. Who is this brother? What does it mean to say that his praise is in the gospel, or his praise is with reference to the gospel? Well, according to several of our early church fathers, Origen, Eusebius, Ephraim, and then Chrysostom and Jerome, who are a little bit later, the brother to whom Paul is referring here is Luke, and the expression whose praise is in or with reference to the gospel refers to the esteem he had been receiving exactly for publishing the gospel according to Luke. And it makes sense because we know Paul used it in his ministry. In 1 Timothy, he actually quotes from the gospel according to Luke in chapter 5, verse 18, and he calls it scripture. So it makes sense that Luke is famous for writing this gospel book and that Paul would use it since Luke has become his traveling companion. And perhaps that's why he took Luke along, Luke who was a Gentile, because Luke presented him with this gospel book that he published and perhaps expressed an interest in writing the book of Acts. Now, I'm just speculating here. We can't prove it, but it makes sense. And if this reference in 2 Corinthians is indeed to Luke, and there is external evidence for that, and 2 Corinthians was written around the year AD 56, then Luke has to have been published before that, the gospel according to Luke, and there would have had to be enough time for it to knowledge of it to spread so that he could get praise throughout all the churches for it. So we're talking now about Luke being before, say, the year AD 54.
How do we know Second Corinthians is written AD 56?
You can put together a picture, a chronology of Paul's missions from the book of Acts. We have some hard years we can put on that. And then we plug in the letters, the epistles, when they're written based on things like where he is when he's writing it. We look at the chronology from Acts that tells us where he was in which city. So if in a letter he says, I'm writing from this city, that narrows it down. Sometimes the people he's with will tell us that. Some of the letters start out as Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy. So we know it has to have come from a time period after he's working with these gentlemen. Remember, he took Silvanus for his second missionary journey after he had that falling out with Barnabas. They'd taken John Mark on the first one. John Mark bailed out partway through. So when Paul decided to go on the second missionary journey, and Barnabas insisted on taking along Mark, and Paul refused, they parted company. And so Paul took Silvanus with him instead of Mark. So we know that any letter that's from Paul and Silvanus has to come from after the start of his second missionary journey. So things like this, the people that are mentioned, the events that are being mentioned, allow us to pin down dates, probably not to the exact year. Could have been perhaps 55. We can't say exactly, but it's pretty close. AD 56 is a pretty good estimate of when it was written.
Okay, so where does that leave us?
So far, based on the internal evidence and that one piece of external evidence I just covered, Luke was written in the year 54 or earlier. Mark was earlier than that. Matthew earlier than that. So that pushes Mark and Matthew almost certainly at least into the 40s and possibly even into the 30s. Now, we should mention this other piece of internal evidence because it is brought up by scholars, particularly liberal scholars. In Matthew 28, 13 to 15, this is the account of the tomb guards who were there when the angel came and rolled back the stone. They became like dead men. And we find here in this passage where the guards go into Jerusalem and report what happened to the chief priests. The chief priests consult with the elders and they decide to bribe the tomb guards. And they say to them, tell them his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So they took the money and did as they were instructed. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. So the liberal scholars will leap upon this phrase here, until this day, and say, well, look, a lot of time must have passed between when this happened and when Matthew wrote this. Of course, liberals don't think it was Matthew who wrote it, but it must have been a long time. What do you think? Does that sound like Matthew must have come long after the fact?
No. I mean, I say until this day all the time, for short periods of time. Even with the pandemic, you can say, oh, until this day.
Yeah, we've been locked down until this day. You could say that, I suppose. Yes, if this false rumor about what happened at the resurrection had gotten out and I immediately corrected it and people kept saying the false thing, then yeah, I could say even after a year, certainly 2 years or 3 years, I could be saying until this day, because I would have expected that rumor to have been done away with the instant the truth was reported. There's another one in Matthew 27, 7 to 8, where it says, and they consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. And once again, you see that phrase there, to this day. And hear about naming a place, well, that probably would be longer, wouldn't it?
Still, even if to this day doesn't necessarily mean that a lot of time passed, it does seem more likely, doesn't it?
From this one. But I would say I don't think that we can conclude that.
Why not?
Well, the thing to do is to look into the Bible for places where this expression is used, where we can see from the information there what time period it's referring to. And we find an excellent example of that in Acts 26, verses 19 to 23. And here's where Paul has already been arrested. He's on his way to Rome, or he's going to be on his way to Rome. He's in prison, and he gets a chance to make his case before King Agrippa. And we read this. Therefore, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but declared first to those in Damascus and in Jerusalem and throughout all the region of Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that they should repent, turn to God, and do works befitting repentance. Now, pay particular attention to this part starting in verse 21. For these reasons, the Jews seized me in the temple and tried to kill me. Therefore, having obtained help from God, to this day I stand witnessing both to small and great, saying no other things than those which the prophets and Moses said would come, that the Christ would suffer, that he would be the first to rise from the dead, and would proclaim light to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. So now here Paul talks about being seized in the temple, and then he's talking to Agrippa, and he uses that phrase, to this day. Okay? Well, Paul was arrested in May or June of the year 57. We can follow the chronology in Acts, so where he's speaking to Agrippa would be probably August or so in the year 59. So it's barely 2 years later, and yet Paul describes it as to this day. So this is a smoking gun proof that to this day does not mean that a long period of time has passed, certainly not more than just over 2 years.
Okay, you said that the authors of the standard textbook we were mentioning put Mark to the late 50s and Luke to 60. What do they say about Matthew?
Well, actually, this is where the whole thing becomes a mess. You remember that they put Mark into the late 50s because they said they were required to do so since Luke dated to the year 60, since Acts dates to 62, which we agree with. They're correct about that. So they put Luke to 60, and they put Mark, which they believe came first, into the late 50s. So where do you fit Matthew? And even before that, when they discuss Luke, and they look at the dating of Luke, they don't put Luke to AD 60, but they put him into the early 60s. So they put him into the year 60 to set the date of Mark, but then they dispense with that and assign a new date to Luke. And they put him into the early 60s, which becomes a problem as well, because if Acts was published in 62, as they say, and Luke is in the early 60s, what are we talking about? 61, 62? It's published in the same year as Acts? Possibly, but not super likely. So they're really kind of painting themselves into a corner here. And then when they look at Matthew, the only evidence that they appeal to from the church fathers at all is to say that Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria disagreed about whether Peter was alive when Mark was written. So they really can't draw anything from the external evidence. So when it comes to dates for Matthew, all they can do is list a number of subjective suppositions, and they conclude that, quote, the preponderance of evidence suggests that Matthew was published before 70, most probably during the 60s, unquote. And you see the problem here. As when they were dating Mark, the evidence indeed says that Matthew was before 70, but that means it could be anywhere from 33 up to 69. They offer no evidence at all to justify their claim that it was most probably during the 60s. And this is what we see in New Testament scholarship all the time. Ideas are floated, ideas become probably, and then the probably becomes accepted as the fact. And it really is no evidence, no real evidence given for these dates that we see in the standard textbook.
So what is the best estimate for the dates of publication of Matthew, Mark, and Luke when we take into the account all the evidence we have?
Well, we've seen from the internal evidence and that little one piece of external evidence that the gospel according to Luke was published in the year 54 or earlier, Mark earlier than that, and Matthew earlier still in the 40s or possibly even the 30s. That's where internal evidence took us. Now let's look at the external evidence to see if we can pin the dates down more precisely. A church father, early church father, Clement of Alexandria, wrote this for us. Quote, when Peter had publicly preached the word at Rome, and by the Spirit had proclaimed the gospel, those present, who were many, exhorted Mark, as one who had followed him for a long time and remembered what had been spoken, to make a record of what was said, and that he did this and distributed the gospel among those that asked him. And that when the matter came to Peter's knowledge, he neither strongly forbade it nor urged him forward. And that's recorded for us in Historia Ecclesiastica, book 6, chapter 14, section 6 onwards. So according to Clement's testimony, Peter was still alive at this time, but it looks like he's no longer in Rome. He left the church in Rome, and this is why they want a written account of his teachings. So the question becomes, when did he go to Rome, and when did he return from Rome? Well, one idea, and this is backed up by tradition, goes to this. You remember in the book of Acts, chapter 12, this is where Herod has put James, the brother of John, to death. And he saw that it pleased the people, so he arrested Peter. And Peter was going to be put to death as well. He's in a jail, he's chained up, he's got guards around him. The church is having a prayer meeting for him, praying for him. And during the night, an angel appears and miraculously delivers Peter. And Peter goes to the house, he knocks on the door, and one of the girls who checks on him doesn't even think it must be his ghost or something. But he keeps knocking. And we read in verses 16 to 17, now Peter continued knocking. And when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But motioning to them with his hand to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he said, go tell these things to James and to the brethren. And he departed and went to another place. Now, interestingly, Peter's been front and center in the book of Acts to this point, into chapter 12. And after he departed and went to another place, he disappears. He doesn't show up again until chapter 15. Now, again, we can piece together the chronology of Acts. And so this, when he left, would be about the year 42. And we're told by Jerome in his Liber Pontificalis that the other place was Rome. This is where Peter went at this point to escape Herod. Herod had no jurisdiction in Rome. So Peter went there, and presumably he would have returned after the death of Herod Agrippa, which was in the year 44. We know he returned at some point between then and 49, because he is there in Acts chapter 15 in the Jerusalem Council, which took place in AD 49. So this information should then help us to pin down the date for Mark.
Wait, this may be what Clement records, but didn't you say the authors of the text say that the testimony is divided? That Irenaeus records that Mark wrote after the deaths of Peter and Paul? That would be a big contradiction, and how could we know who was right?
I did say that. You're correct. And they do claim that. You're correct about that. But in fact, there is no actual contradiction.
No? So why do so many commentators insist that Mark was written after Peter had died, based on Irenaeus?
Well, if you ask me my opinion, I think it's because they wanted to late date these books. The pretext, and if some of them, I think, just accept this in good faith, but haven't bothered to check carefully. Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresies, book 3, chapter 1, writes this: Matthew, indeed, among the Hebrews, in their own dialect, put forth also a writing of the gospel, while Peter and Paul were evangelizing in Rome and founding the church. After the exodus of these, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also has himself handed on to us in writing the things proclaimed by Peter.
And? Well,
look at the wording. It says, after the exodus of these. And the scholars take it to mean the death of these. They say Exodus refers to the death of Peter and Paul. And so Irenaeus is telling us that Mark published his gospel after the death of Peter and Paul. And sometimes it'll actually be put into the translation, instead of saying after the exodus of these, it says after the death of these. And so somebody reading this in good faith will think, yeah, okay, Irenaeus is saying that Mark came after the death of Peter in 64. And this illustrates, once again, why it's good to know Koine Greek and have the initiative and take the initiative to check these things. So the claim is that after the death of these, the death of Peter and Paul, Mark wrote the book, which will put it after 64, maybe even after 68. Problem with this is that the usual Greek word for death is thanatos. Thanatos. It's not exodus. Exodus literally means a departure, a going away. Now, that's its normal use. Sometimes it is used as a euphemism for death. But the question then is, why do we assume in this passage we should take it as a euphemism for death instead of its normal meaning, departure?
I think there is no reason. Actually, earlier when you read out that part from the early church father saying Exodus, I actually thought it meant they left. So I guess really nobody can argue one way or the other definitively.
Maybe we can. Okay. If we take it as departure, it would mean that what Irenaeus is saying is that after their departure from Rome, and it could be referring to there, could be referring back to Paul and Peter, or it could even be referring to Peter and Mark. And then it fits in perfectly with Clement, because not only does it have Mark publishing while Peter's still alive, but remember the way Clement put it together is that Paul seems to leave Rome and that people want a written record, so Mark offers it. So after their departure from Rome fits in perfectly with Clement.
But can we know which way Irenaeus used the word Exodus here?
Yeah, can we be sure? Well, considering that according to the usual usage, Exodus means departure, the burden of proof would be on those who want to say that it means death. But in this case, we don't have to wonder. A New Testament scholar named E. Earl Ellis actually went through all of the writings of Irenaeus in Greek, in the original Greek, to see how he uses language. And what he found is that Irenaeus never used Exodus to mean death. Every time he uses Exodus, he means departure. Whenever he talks about death, he always uses the standard word thanatos. So if Irenaeus doesn't use Exodus for death elsewhere, he didn't use it for death here. He was talking about the departure. And so suddenly we see that there's not a contradiction in the patristic testimony here, the testimony of the church fathers. They dovetail together perfectly.
So where are we now?
Well, we have now the gospel according to Luke before the year 54, the gospel according to Mark probably before AD 45, and Matthew before that, somewhere between 35 and 44.
Anything more?
There is a second line of evidence pointing to these dates and allowing us to be even more precise. They're what's called the family 35 colophons.
That's a mouthful. Family 35 colophons. What are those?
Colophons is a fancy word scholars use for inscriptions. When manuscripts were written by hand, as the Bible was for hundreds of years until the printing press was invented, until that time, the Bible was copied on handwritten manuscripts. And in many cases, the scribe, when he finished copying a book, would put a little inscription at the end, which would give information, which might include who copied the manuscript and when it was copied, or some information about the writing. So that's what a colophon is. It's one of these inscriptions added at the end of a book by the scribe who copied the book. Family 35 refers to a group of New Testament manuscripts. Scholars tend to classify the manuscripts into different groups that they call families. And Family 35 is a group of several hundred New Testament manuscripts that were copied very, very carefully. Now, they're relatively late. They date from the 13th to the 15th century. About half of these have colophons at the end of the gospel books. The scribe copying it down when he finished a book puts information at the end of it. At the end of the gospel according to Mark, he put a note saying that this was published or given out 8 years after the ascension. At the end of the gospel according to Mark, he put a note saying it was published 10 years after the ascension, that is the ascension of Jesus up into heaven after he'd been with the disciples for 40 days. At the end of the gospel according to Luke, he put out a note saying that the gospel according to Luke was published 15 years after the ascension of Jesus. And at the end of the gospel according to John, he put out a note saying that the gospel according to John was published 32 years after the ascension of Jesus. So this actually gives us very precise dates for these books. That would put Matthew at the year 41 or 42, Mark to 43 or 44, Luke to 48 or 49, and John to the year 64 or 65, which are very precise, and they fit exactly into what we've seen already.
When the scribes copy these manuscripts, do they also copy the original colophon that's on the manuscript that they're copying from?
Well, that would be the question. Since these manuscripts are relatively late, as I said, can we actually trust the colophons? And I think we can for two reasons. First, as Dr. Wilbur Pickering, who's an expert in this field, and possibly the top expert when it comes to these, he points out that the colophons were actually very widespread among manuscripts from many different sources. And to have these colophons, and about 50% of them, says that the tradition that was being copied here must have been very ancient. Now, do note that the gospel texts in the manuscripts themselves are much older than the manuscripts. One of these manuscripts might come from the 13th century, but the books in it come from the 1st century. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So there's no reason the colophons themselves cannot be also equally old or very old. But if that's all we had, yes, it would be questionable, but there's another reason.
What is the other reason?
The other reason is the third line of evidence that converges on these dates. And that is commentary from Eusebius, that church father who was the greatest church historian, wrote Historia Ecclesiastica, History of the Church, and a book called Chronicon or Chronicle in the early 4th century. And he had access to the very earliest material at the time. Now, in his book Chronicon, Eusebius places the writing of Matthew into the 3rd year of Caligula, the Roman emperor. Now, the 3rd year of Caligula matches what you find in the Family 35 colophon exactly. The 3rd year of Caligula is the 8th year after the ascension. But since they're worded differently, Eusebius is writing in terms of the year of the Roman emperor. The colophons are talking about the year after ascension. It suggests that they're drawing on different sources of information when they give the dates. So that's the two lines of evidence there converge exactly. And then in his book, Historia Ecclesiastica, Eusebius tells us that Mark wrote after Peter left Rome, which we've seen already in other sources of information. The question is, when did Peter leave Rome? And in Chronicon, Eusebius tells us that that happened in the 3rd year of Claudius, the next emperor. And the 3rd year of Claudius would be the 10th year after the ascension. So again, the information we get from Eusebius, which is early, not late, matches exactly what we see in the colophons, which come later. And I find that extremely significant. We have two different sources here, drawing from two different original fonts of information, and yet converging on the exact same dates. To me, that means there's no good reason not to accept it. It seems to me that those who then want to argue for different dates have the burden of proof on them. Now, Eusebius doesn't tell us about what year Luke was published in or John, but since he's so accurate, they match so exactly on Matthew and Mark, I think we should accept then what colophons say about the date of Luke and the date of John. So in conclusion then to this part, we see that internal and external evidence sets clear limits on the possible dates of these books, and they agree with the specifics that we see in those colophons and in Eusebius. So I think we should conclude that the Gospel according to Matthew was published in the year 41 or 42, Mark in the year 43 or 44, and Luke in the year 48 or 49. We'll look at the Gospel according to John in another program.
Well, I think the evidence from the colophons and from Eusebius are really amazing in accuracy. If you think about it, they come from different sources. I think should be very convincing to people when these gospel books were originally written.
It should be. I agree with you. And the sad thing is, it's almost never mentioned. You find those standard textbooks that I mentioned, they never refer to these, and I'm not sure why. Of all the sources I've looked at, all the different scholarly books, I only ever found one that actually referred to the information from Eusebius, and that was John Wenham's book, Redating Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So, and this is why I say that for the kind of elite level apologetics that is needed at this time when Christianity is under such assault, we need to really do our homework and get the best information. The result of what we've looked at then is that our knowledge of Jesus, of who he was, what he did, his miracles, his ministry, his teachings, his death on the cross, his resurrection from the dead, we know to be based on eyewitness testimony written by people who knew him, or in the case of Luke, who got information from eyewitnesses directly, people in a position to know, publishing very early, 8, 10, 15 years after the ascension of Jesus, 32 in the case of John. The claim of the liberal scholars that they're anonymous, these books, and published long after the fact, claims that were never based on evidence, are clearly wrong. Now, what's more, what we typically hear from evangelical scholars and apologists is also wrong. I recall this claim that we mentioned earlier from a functionary from a popular creation science ministry. She said, the accounts in the Gospels are neither the only nor the earliest evidence we have of Christian writing about the resurrection. That honor goes to 1 Thessalonians, one of the earliest of Paul's letters, which was written around AD 50. Now, I pointed out that this is actually a very problematic claim because it would mean that we're dependent not on eyewitnesses for the earliest evidence, but on people who were not eyewitnesses being informed by somebody else who was not an eyewitness. And it turns out then that this claim is wrong. The accounts in the gospel books are the earliest that we have about the resurrection of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were all published before 1 Thessalonians, before any of Paul's letters. The functionary went on to say this, so we have evidence that about 2 decades after Christ's death, there was a group of people who insisted he was raised from the dead and had built a decent portion of their theology around that fact, which doesn't happen overnight. Now, I pointed out that that meant that the earliest evidence we had for the resurrection of Jesus is that a group of people who are not eyewitnesses of the risen Jesus, living in a city in the Hellenic world far from Israel, about 2 decades after Christ's death, believed that Jesus was raised from the dead because they had been told that by another man who was himself not an eyewitness of the risen Jesus. And we pointed out that that is very, very weak stuff. But now we see the reality is that we are not dependent on the insistence of a group of people who are not eyewitnesses who heard from another guy who was not an eyewitness. We have personal testimony from the Apostle Matthew, who spent 3 years or so with Jesus during his ministry and who saw him after he had risen for 40 days, during which he showed himself alive by many infallible proofs. And he recorded this for us a mere 8 years after the fact. Same thing in the case of Peter, the apostle, who had his testimony recorded by Mark 10 years, published 10 years after the fact, and Luke, who got his information straight from eyewitnesses and recorded it, published it 15 years after the fact. It also debunks the claim that the gospel accounts were penned decades after the events they describe, from AD 55 to 85. No, they were penned from AD 41 to 64, which is not decades, except in the case of John. And they do not go back to early tradition. They are direct eyewitness testimony, standing solid as a rock and foundation for our faith.
Thank you, John. That was very interesting and very edifying, because it's very important for us to know where these claims come from. Where were the claims of Jesus rising from the dead, which is in itself quite unbelievable. And if you don't have eyewitness accounts, that would make that claim very weak indeed. So I think this session is finished, and I hope that we will come back again and listen to another topic next week.
Indeed, we will. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.